This is the fourth talk in a series called A Critique of Bob Black's The Abolition of Work. This video follows a thought experiment I developed called The Farmer and the Thieves. Here, I'll try to give an account of what I hope to demonstrate in the previous exercise. So, welcome back to the actual world. What we did was we took a trip to an imagined scenario, a possible world, in which we took Bob Black's advice in the abolition of work and abolished work. Well, we gave it our best shot, I think. We got rid of activities that are forced rather than free. We got rid of activities that are done for someone or something else's sake. But what happened? Well, eventually, we just ended up recreating the worlds that we had at the start. We ended up right where we started, with a system in which some people were better off than others, a system in which those in power abused their power, misused their power, a system in which your access to certain resources determines your ability to, have the things you need to survive. There weren't any novel problems that abolishing work introduced. Not one. All of the problems and all of the benefits, however many there might be of each, were present at the beginning of the experiment and at the end. It would have been easy to start off by saying, look, we've got this great system called capitalism, and there's absolutely no problems with it. And this crazy man named Bob Black is trying to take all that away with his abolish work plan, and look how terrible that's going to be. But that's not what I did. I started out by acknowledging mostly problems that are present in a capitalist system, while also acknowledging what I think is a pretty big benefit, which namely, I don't need to have had some kind of wilderness survival training in order to survive in the modern world. I think that's pretty cool, but there are many downsides with that. And one of those, broadly speaking, is some people are better off in that system than others. Some people do better than others. I just don't see why that would change if we got rid of work. I also don't see, I just don't imagine a world in which we actually abolished work, except only nominally speaking. We really didn't abolish work, ultimately, in this possible world. We just got rid of it temporarily and reinstituted it with a different name, just like we did with everything else that Black said was useless. I think what I was trying to show with each addition that we made to our utopia, which if you have to keep adding things to a utopia, it's not very utopian, I suppose. But every time that something got added into the mix, we called it by some overly complicated name. What I was trying to show is that, look, all these things that Bob Black thinks are necessary only because society has made it so, well, we got rid of society. We got rid of all these things. And people still felt a need. There was a need at some point for someone to have access to new knowledge that they didn't have before. So they needed a teacher. There was a need for people to be protected from those who wanted to harm them. So there was a need for some kind of the rule enforcers, as we called them. There were downsides to that too, just like there's downsides to it in the real world. In numerous places in his essay, Bob Black tells us that unless we abolish work, a better world is just simply impossible to attain. And nowhere in his essay does he suggest that it's even possible that abolishing work would lead to anything other than a better world to live in. So in other words, we know at least two things: that on Bob Black's view, abolishing work can only lead to a better world, and only abolishing work can lead to a better world. So if we wanted to put that in the form of like a logical sentence, it might look something like this. If we let the letter A stand for we abolish work, the letter B stands for world is a better place to live in, we have a better world, something like that. We know by now what Black means by abolishing work, and we have a pretty good idea of what a better world would look like, if only because we know what kinds of problems he sees in the world at present and the fact that he attributes all these problems to work. We can infer what a better world would look like, a world without all these problems. And so if Black offers no scenario in which A does not entail B, and in numerous places he asserts that unless A, B is impossible to obtain, then necessarily, if A, then B. Necessarily, if we abolish work, the world will be a better place. So what would we need to challenge this claim? And specifically the element of necessity that's attached to it. What would we need to object to that meaningfully? Well, we would need to be able to come up with some possible worlds in which we do abolish work, but we don't get a better world. And we don't have to get a worse world. It doesn't have to be like, well, imagine if we abolish work and the world is worse. Maybe we abolish work and space aliens come and take over planet Earth because we're just kind of laying around all day. We're not really doing anything. They take advantage of that and take over the planet. We don't need to... I don't believe in trying to match one person's extreme with another. I actually think it's better to try and even things out. And at most, what we can say from thinking through this experiment, if you follow my line of reasoning, what I'm able to derive from this is really nothing that fancy. It's not a big fireworks show. It's just this. It's possible, at least possible, that abolishing work won't lead to a better world. Might not necessarily lead to a worse one, but it certainly won't necessarily lead to a better one. It could happen, maybe. But I can think of at least one scenario in which that's not what happens. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that abolishing work will and can only lead to a better world to live in. So if there's one major leg of Black's argument that I think we've kind of deflated, it would be his argument from necessity. I think we saw that each time we added something into the post-work worlds that we had before and just called a different name. What we were seeing was that, Black thinks that society is what makes all these things seem necessary, like work and laws and teachers and so forth. But actually, it's people. And maybe it's not either or. Maybe there's a little bit of both. But Black doesn't even allow for that. Black doesn't even allow for the possibility that any of the things we have in place in society, any of the roles we've established for people to fulfill in society, that none of these could possibly have come from an actual need emanating from people themselves. And I just don't think that's the case. Somebody once said that if God didn't exist, we would just end up inventing him anyway. Well, I guess what I'm saying is I think you could say something similar about work and about a lot of the things in place in society today that Bob Black thinks are only nominally necessary. I think they are actually necessary. And I think that this necessity emanates from us in a lot of these cases. That's something I think he doesn't really acknowledge. What I want to do next time is I actually want to return to something we kind of hovered around in, I suppose, the summary of problems video, particularly where I talked about Black's fascination with the work of anthropologist Marshall Sahlins. I mentioned a work by another anthropologist who was critical of Sahlins named David Kaplan. While I was researching Sahlins' work and some other scholars who subscribed to a similar idea, namely the idea that we have lost something as we've progressed, into modernity, We've kind of fallen from grace, so to speak. This idea that we just have to get back to some original state of affairs to fix all the problems. I think that's, I don't know what you would call it, but I think that has all the makings of some kind of an ideology. Maybe we want to call it the Antiquarian Ideology, which I'm taking from David Hackett Fisher's Antiquarian Fallacy. Fisher was a historian who wrote a very well-known book called Historian's Fallacies, really great book about fallacies, and it wasn't even written by a philosopher. And one of the fallacies that he conceives of is what he calls the Antiquarian Fallacy. Basically, this is the idea that just because we did things one way at one point in time, that it must be better. And he describes the antiquarian as someone who is kind of fixated on the past and kind of resentful towards the present, confused by the present, irritated by it. And he thinks that a lot of the attraction to these kinds of ideologies, these kinds of theories which attempt to explain all of the world's problems in terms of, well, it's because we've been thrown out of Eden. We need to go back to living in the forest and, running around in pre-society, pre-civilization. We need to go back to something like that, and everything will be fine. He really digs into what makes that line of thinking attractive. And that's something I really appreciate, and that's something I actually would like to try and flesh out a little bit more. Because I think at its heart, Bob Black's abolition of work is very much in line with that sort of view. I think Black is more than clear that he thinks that returning to some original state of affairs will solve all the problems that we have today. I have a sneaking suspicion that Bob Black is not the only one who feels this way. I'm sure lots of people do. I suspect especially that people that find his ideas appealing probably feel a similar way. I think it's so important to try and understand why someone finds a particular school of thought attractive in the first place, especially if it's a school of thought that I don't subscribe to and don't agree with. I don't think we do ourselves any favors by simply writing things off like, well, people find this abolish work thing attractive because they just don't want to work. I don't think that's true, and I also don't think that's very helpful in furthering any kind of dialogue that we might have that might actually amount to something meaningful, which is what I'm hoping to try and do here. And I also just, quite honestly, find these kinds of things interesting. I find it interesting to get in somebody else's head and try and understand why they think the way they do. And philosophy enables me to do that. So that's what we'll be doing next time. We'll be kind of, as I called in the introduction, putting Bob Black's essay on the bookshelf, meaning kind of trying to see where it fits in with other philosophers' works in the history of philosophy and perhaps some other scholars. We'll see some kind of overlap between philosophy and anthropology, two disciplines that don't always exactly get along. There's some reasons for that, but so it'll be interesting to see some overlap between the two here. And I hope that you'll join me for that. I hope that you've been enjoying this series as much as I've been enjoying making it, and take care. Thanks.